All right. So, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our presentation on tracing Jane Austen's artistry through six ball scenes. And this is hosted by the Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho region of Jasna. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about plot. And before we start, I just wanted to say one of the things that kind of led me to doing this presentation was reading Collins Hemingway's new book, Jane Austen and the Creation of Modern Fiction, which is highly recommended. Um, and so Hemingway really goes through kind of the process of writing and really kind of takes apart the nuts and bolts of how Austen creates her stories. And so, in general, a good plot shows how people respond in real situations. Um, and the ball scenes tend to be pretty interesting in the books in that there's kind of a lot that happens because there's a lot of people coming together. And then there's also plot points that the ball about at the plot points that happen at the balls that reverberate later in the text. So then I'm just going to go down and we'll talk about description, and then I will stop the presentation and we'll have the discussion, and then we'll go back to the rest of the presentation. So for description, um, Hemingway says, description is text that gives the reader a mental image of a situation. To qualify as description, the text must provide enough detail to make readers believe that they are seeing a real person, place, or thing. The best scenic description comes from the observations made by the characters themselves. The attitudes and emotions of the characters should determine what details she perceives from her surroundings. And I have a couple of examples from the Watson. So this example is the narrator's voice. Emma Watson was not more than of middle height, well made and plump, with an air of healthy vigor. Her skin was very brown, but clear, smooth, and glowing, which, with a lively eye, a sweet smile, and an open countenance, gave beauty to attract and expression to make that beauty improve on acquaintance. Um, so you get a little bit of Marianne in Sense and Sensibility in this description, but probably much more detailed than she does in her later works. And also another one from the Watsons from the sweetest boy, Charles Blake, who's talking to Emma, and he says, you may come to Wickstead and see Mamma, and she can take you to the castle. There's a monstrous, curious stuffed fox there, and a badger. Anyone would think they were alive. So this is clearly a description from a 10-year-old boy's perspective. Like, he doesn't care about the castle, but there's a really cool fox there. So for each ball scene, just kind of thinking about how much description is there, and is it the narrator who voices the description, or parts of the scene described through the heroine's or other characters' eyes? Do you have a favorite description for each scene? And do you feel like there's anything missing from the description in Austen's chapters compared to novels by other authors? Okay, so we're going to stop share. So kind of plot and description. Any thoughts with those two from the different chapters?
I was thinking that a lot of the novel's plots are turned or carried on very well from the ball scenes. They seem often are very necessary for the plot, or at least I think so.
Yeah, especially Pride and Prejudice. It's really a pivotal. There's Darcy refers back to it in his letter, and there's just a lot that happens there. Um, Emma is one of my favorite ball scenes because, that's where Emma suddenly finally realizes that, hey, Mr. Knightley is kind of attractive.
Also thought it was very interesting that Austen used Miss Bates to describe the scene so thoroughly in Emma. She seemed to be the major narrator. Her running dialogue. Oh, look over there. There's Mr. Oh, and look at the decorations. And it's just classic Miss Bates.
Yeah. There's, I think Mary Lascelles, who's one of the early writers about Jane Austen, said, like, ignore Miss Bates at your peril. Like, if you don't read what she says, you miss out on really important details.
I was surprised by how much description I found in the Watsons. And I actually greatly enjoyed it because I had not read the Watsons for a long, long time. And I was trying to think of your questions about like how that might change or how much is there, perhaps who gives it. So I was wondering if because the Watsons was incomplete, whether Austen would have removed much of that and perhaps there might have been more dialogue to reveal things or what because it just seemed very there was plentiful description in a way
Yeah.
that maybe is not quite the same as it varies in my opinion it varies among the books but and I really don't know if there was a pattern that it gets less over time but anyway I that was my observation.
Yeah, I really like the Watsons, and when I was doing the notations, I was switching. I was like editing it to make sure it lined up with the version that sort of reflects her capitalizations, her spellings, and things like that. So I was almost going like word by word with it. And it really is when you do like a slow read of that, you really notice, yeah, there's a lot of detail, but not a lot of detail about Mr. Howard, who is supposedly the love interest. So it's kind of interesting, like what becomes there is a lot of detail, but it's not necessarily the detail that maybe the normal reader would want to know. Like, well, what does Mr. Howard really look like?
Oh, okay. Okay.
It kind of parallels the way she introduces Darcy in Pride and Prejudice later. We're told just a little bit about his appearance and his wealth, but we really don't find out much about his character. I mean, you get little snippets of his interactions with Bingley here and there, and then the sisters, but it's a small dribble at the beginning, and it grows throughout the novel. It leaves you starting strongly from Elizabeth's perspective and it's in the Watsons, you get it very strongly from the female perspective at the start as well. She's clearly attracted to him and interested in him, but you don't really get very much of a picture of, like you said, who he is and what his character is like.
Yeah. I've never read any continuations of the Watsons because I always feel like nobody can get Austen as good as Austen. Any other thoughts about plot or description?
Thing that struck me as I compared the ballroom scenes, and I guess I'd noticed this, but it hadn't really come across as strongly as it did this time, is how much they had to pay attention to which woman would open or lead the dance. I mean, that sorting out of rank versus privilege based on the occasion, like was it a new bride getting recognized? They really had to struggle like in a couple places with, this should be Emma's chance to shine, but it's the new Mrs. Elton that will expect to go first now. And I thought it was funny, particularly in Emma, where she said it almost made her mad enough to want to get married so she could upstage Mrs. Elton.
Yeah, and in the Watsons, like it's Miss Carr that, wants to call the dance.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, the Watsons is a very clear thing about everyone being upset about the latecomers being able to jump in and lead when that shouldn't have been the way it unfolded, right?
Okay, go back to the presentation and hopefully we'll be at the right spot. Okay. Yeah, I think the other thing that maybe just in terms of what's missing from the presentation, from the descriptions is a lot of times Jane Austen will give some physical description, but she doesn't give the specifics of like, oh, Emma Woodhouse has dark hair. She tells you the eye color in that one, but so that's kind of interesting that, and she hardly ever describes what people are wearing. And so that's another one where sometimes you read a book and it's just dripping with descriptions of things. I like Austen's way better. Okay, so when we talk about dialogue, so we're so used to reading the books that the dialogue in its specificity is so wonderful, but I thought it would be kind of interesting to try to pull back a little bit and just look at some numbers. And it kind of became kind of interesting when I did that. So what I was doing was I was looking at turns at speaking and not like how many sentences someone said. Um, and then there are also lots of situations where Austen would summarize someone's speech, but she doesn't quote them directly. So the total number of speakers are the people that she's quoting directly in each of the ballroom scenes. And then I looked at the number of times that the heroine speaks and the number of times that the hero speaks. So it is kind of interesting. Catherine or the Bower had only 5 speakers total. The Watsons had 11, which is pretty high. Northanger Abbey only had 5. Pride and Prejudice, 11. So there's a lot of people there. Some of them are talking. Mansfield Park had 8, and Emma had 8. And then in terms of the number of times that the heroine speaks, Kitty speaks 17 times. Emma Watson speaks 11. Northanger Abbey, Catherine speaks 29 times. Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth speaks 25 times. Mansfield Park, Fanny speaks 3 times that she's directly quoted. I found that one shocking when I went through it. And then in Emma, that it's, doesn't really speak that much either. It's 8 times. Looking at the number of times that the hero speaks, there's, some parallels, but usually less than how much the heroine speaks. So I don't really think Edward Stanley is the hero of Catherine or the Bower, but he's the one that she dances with. He speaks 12 times. In the Watsons, Mr. Howard is never quoted. His speech is summarized, but not quoted. But we do have Charles speaking 12 times, the Charles Blake, the boy. Northanger Abbey, Henry Tilney speaks 16 times, so still pretty high. Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy speaks 14 times. Mansfield Park, Edmund Bertram speaks 2 times. Again, that whole chapter just kind of shocked me when I started looking at the numbers. And then Mr. Knightley speaks 8 times in Emma. So then I went through for each chapter and I kind of looked at, besides the heroine and the hero, how many times do the other people speak? So in Catherine or the Bower, as I mentioned, Kitty was 17, Edward was 12. Camilla, the sister, is 11. Mrs. Percival is 3. Mrs. Stanley is 1. Mr. Stanley is kind of summarized indirectly by the narrator. The Watsons, pretty interesting who's high up. Emma has 11, Charles Blake has 12, Tom Musgrave has 10, which, Emma doesn't want to talk to him at all, but he's got a lot of speaking lines. Mary Edwards has 8, Mrs. Edwards has 7, Mr. Edwards has 6, Lord Osborne has 6, mainly speaking to Tom. Mrs. Blake has 3, Miss Osborne has 3, the waiter has 1, and the crowd saying the Osbornes are here has 1. And then indirect summaries from the narrator for both Mr. Howard and Captain Hunter. Northanger Abbey, there's a little bit that happens before the ball scene. And so Catherine speaks 29 times total. Henry Tilney is 16, Eleanor Tilney is 6, Isabella Thorpe is 5, John Thorpe is 4, and indirect is General Tilney and Mrs. Hughes. And there are several times where the direct speaker's speech is also summarized by the narrator. Pride and Prejudice, interesting because it's got so many different speakers. So Elizabeth speaks 25 times. There's a lot of dialogue in the Netherfield Ball chapter. Mr. Darcy has 14, Mr. Collins has 5, Jane Bennet has 3, all to Elizabeth, nothing between Jane and nothing that's quoted between Jane and Mr. Bingley. Caroline Bingley has 2, Mr. Bennet has 1, Sir William has 1, Denny has 1, Charlotte Lucas has 1, Mrs. Bennet has 1, and Lydia Bennet has 1. Her sort of, Lord, I'm tired at the end. Indirect summaries by the narrator for anything that Mr. Bingley says, and then what Mrs. Hurst says. And then there are several times where people who are direct speakers also have their speech summarized indirectly. So I think the Pride and Prejudice scene probably takes the cake for the most kind of complexity of dialogue. Mansfield Park, so there seems like there's a lot of speakers. There's 8, but nobody really says that much. Fanny has 3, Edmund has 2, Sir Thomas has 5, Mary Crawford has 3, Henry Crawford has 2, William Price has 2, Lady Bertram has 2, Mrs. Norris has 1. And then there are several times where people who are direct speakers also have their speech summarized. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's never really a lot of conversation between Fanny and Henry Crawford in this scene. So there's one where Henry's kind of sitting with Fanny at the end and trying to get angling for an invitation for breakfast. And then Emma speaks 8 times. Mr. Knightley speaks 8 times. Frank Churchill is 6. Mrs. Elton is 6. Mr. Weston is 3. Mrs. Weston is 3. Mr. Elton is 2. Miss Bates is 2. And as Cindy noted, she is quite verbose. We never hear Jane Fairfax speak directly. Her speech is summarized several times. And then there are other times where the direct speaker's speech is summarized. So we kind of went through whose speech is quoted, whose speech is summarized. Kind of any thoughts on why specific character speech is not directly quoted? And then those of you who went to the discussion that we had maybe last year, I think, about dialogue and Pride and Prejudice, dialogue in that scene, the Netherfield Ball really sparkles, especially between Lizzie and Darcy. But Any other specific dialogue that you like in the different ball scenes? So we're gonna stop share and go back to discussion. Um, yeah, and so was that interesting, like going through the numbers? And I think when I like really stopped and read the Mansfield Park chapter especially, I was kind of like, she's in Fanny's head almost the whole scene. And so there's just a lot, and that's going to be our next section that we talk about. But I think that's why Mansfield Park and the Emma chapter at the Crown are both have less dialogue because there's so much that it's filtered through um, Emma or Fanny's consciousness. So everyone loves the Pride and Prejudice, so I know that's got to be there for everyone. Any other dialogue that you like?
Well, surprisingly, when I went back and reread the extract, in Northanger Abbey, Henry Tilney's delightful way of speaking, and the even looking at, I printed this out and I said, okay, someone speaks for a paragraph, and then Catherine speaks for like a half of a sentence. She's so artless, she's so direct, but so sweet. And it's like, it's very, very interesting to take more time by going through the chapters and reading with like an intent in mind, like trying to look for things like the way that you pose them in the questions, and then reading with that purpose is actually a lot of fun.
I picked
Yeah.
that part of Northanger Abbey because I wanted, so there's several times where they dance together, but I wanted the one where like they already know each other, so they're kind of used to each other. And I just love how Henry is like really kind of pushing Catherine to tell him that she likes him. Um, so, are you going to talk to anyone else if they come up? Um, but yeah, she's just so artless, and her answers are just so short and simple, and he's just, kind of pirouetting around her as he as he talks.
It's not exactly in the ball scene, but the day after in the Watsons, where the estranged sister and her husband come to visit, and the sister's putting on a pretense where she speaks super slowly. I think Austen says she can barely say one word per minute. And then a moment or two later, she drops all of that and goes back to arguing with her husband at normal rates. And I thought that was a very interesting comparison of putting on airs. That you don't really see that much of a shift in front of people in Austen, and I hadn't noticed that before.
Yeah. I feel like they're a precursor to Fanny and John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, because she's like they're both pretty mercenary and judgmental, and yeah.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, you can definitely see some foreshadowing there.
How about anyone else love the talk or the dialogue between Emma and Mr. Knightley at the end of the ball scene? That's what I like about that is like Emma's almost inviting him to criticize her, and he's like, "Nope, I'm not going to do it anymore." And it's like, "You go, Mr. Knightley, you go."
Yeah, and I think they don't have as much to say as in some others, but what they do say really changes the way different relationships are and stuff. Just what little they do say, you can tell things are changing.
Yes, yeah. And I think what's kind of interesting is the only people that actually talk while they're dancing are Lizzie and Darcy and Henry Tilney and Catherine. And I think part of that's because they're both sort of still getting to know each other. You know, we don't really hear any dialogue between Fanny and Edmund or between Emma and Mr. Knightley once they start dancing, because it's kind of like what needs to have been said, especially for Emma and Mr. Knightley, has already been said. So.
Well, I'm thinking of in Emma, the significant event around Mr. Elton refusing to dance with Harriet Smith, but there's so much going on in Emma's mind, her outrage, her all the intense feelings she has, and then the admiration for what Knightley did. But it's not structured so that she's necessarily voicing all that. But boy, talk about a pivot point. Not in terms of maybe dialogue, but certainly in terms of what's going to come next. But I don't know if that's a reflection on just her change in style, or if that's just what really fit that particular book. Because to me, both Emma and Mansfield Park are so much more dense, and they're harder to read, and you have to take your time because it just seems there's so much more there. So,
Yeah, I think comparing Knightley dancing with Harriet, comparing that to the scene in the Watsons where Emma dances with Charles, is one of the things that's interesting. Is in the Watson scene, you really see Charles's distress and his sadness, and how like he's trying to be a brave boy and not cry. And in the Emma scene, what's kind of interesting when I was rereading it is we don't really see Harriet's distress. We see the distress of the situation, and like Emma almost, so it's almost like Emma's just sort of distressed about the situation, but we don't see like her describing what Harriet looks like, or if Harriet is turning red or whatever. So that's, pretty interesting. Um,
is that by design that Emma is not able to think outside of herself yet, or is it just the way it is?
it almost to me seemed like it was like a meta thing of like Emma had like a sense of what the whole situation was, maybe like, so she's got like Mr. Elton that she's keeping track of, she's got Mrs. Elton that she's keeping track of, she's got Harriet, she's got Mrs. Weston, and then she sees Knightley. So I don't know, it almost felt like to me like she's just taking in sort of the whole scene without necessarily the
Uh,
specifics.
uh,
But that's an interesting question.
huh.
Was also purposeful because it's a key point that we twist on later when Harriet has, if we really knew what was going on in Harriet's mind, Harriet was like thinking that Knightley was super her hero and she's now in love with him. Whereas only knowing from Emma's perspective allows us to kind of put all these different people into the picture, and she doesn't hone in and realize she still thinks that Harriet's in love with Mr. Elton for a while, right? I mean, she mistakes that it's Knightley that Harriet has now switched her affections to. And I think if you got inside Harriet's head at that time at the ball, it wouldn't allow that development to happen.
Yeah,
Oh,
so Harriet
uh,
realizes at the ball that Mr. Elton is bad news, and then Emma thinks she likes Frank because Frank saved her from the gypsies. So then that, I think, is one of the other confusions. And Renata had asked a good question in the chat about like, why we didn't include Sense and Sensibility. So in Sense and Sensibility, they go to like a card party, sort of fancy party in London, but there's never really a ball scene where um there's dancing between the main hero and heroine. there's the sort of scene at Sir John's where Marianne and Willoughby are dancing a little bit when they have sort of that impromptu ball. But I was sort of wanting to do like two really early works, two kind of middle period Stevenson novels, and then two of the later ones. So that's kind of why I didn't include a Persuasion and a Sense and Sensibility, because they just didn't have like really good ball scenes like the other ones that we did. Any other thoughts about dialogue?
Yes, I was thinking about the later ball in Northanger Abbey, where some of this same theme of the guy has the right to ask, but the girl has the right to say no, and when uh the what's her name, Isabella or whatever, dances with Captain Tilney, and Catherine is so upset about it, and Henry tries to get her to realize that same thing, that she could say no, but she hasn't, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I'm gonna quote what he says in the next section when we talk about mind reading, because you know Catherine thinks that Captain Tilney wanted to dance with her because he's um, was concerned about Isabella sitting down and feeling bored, and Henry kind of basically tells her like, "Oh, you have no clue." Um, you have no clue, and you're adorable and very good natured. Any other thoughts? Okay, this is doing wonderful. Okay, so make sure. So here's the part that I really love, the kind of representing thoughts and feelings. And so this back picture is from the 1999 Mansfield Park with Johnny Lee Miller and Frances O'Connor, I think, who plays Fanny. So it is not at all kind of similar to the novel, but anything that has Johnny Lee Miller in it is good for me. Um, so when we think about thoughts and feelings, we kind of want to trying to move this, kind of think about like there's different ways that Austen can show thoughts and feelings. So one is direct quotation. A second one is where the narrator just kind of gives you a report. Um, then we're going to talk about free and direct discourse, and that's where the narrator is reporting the feelings or thoughts, but mimicking the character speech patterns. And then the last way is that one character, often the heroine, is tries to infer another's thoughts, motives, or feelings. Okay, so direct quotation, not very often used in Austen. But basically, the way that this would happen is the character's thoughts are presented as if they are spoken with first person pronouns and quotation marks, but clearly it's not said out loud. So here's an example from Northanger Abbey in the chapter that we read. Henry has just told Catherine that General Tilney has asked her name. And so we get this sort of narrator, with real interest and strong admiration did her eye now follow the general as he moved through the crowd, and how handsome a family they are was her secret remark. So we know that this is her thought because it's a secret remark. We know that it's a direct quote because it's sort of in the present tense. And the exclamation point is probably for Catherine another good hint. And then we've got the quotation marks there.
Let me ask a question about this because the quotation marks in that are, I'm not a grammar person, are confusing. Today, would we do that or would we have it as single quotes instead of the two quotate? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I kind of put the double quotes on both places because in the book that you don't really have the first set of quotes.
Sure.
I'm pretty sure in the volume that I used was the Oxford edition from R.W. Chapman's, and I'm pretty sure it was that they used the double quotes. I'm not sure today. I'm not enough of a writer to maybe they would be single quotes. But I think in this example they were the double.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to how that would be translated today.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just a curiosity.
Yeah. I mean, so it might be like she thought, quote, how handsome a family they are, end quote, or something like that, maybe. But this is pretty rare in Austen that she uses this. There's a couple of times in Emma where she does, where, Emma's like thinking about wrongly thinking about Mr. Elton being interested in Harriet. And there's a couple of times where they use the direct quotes for that. But yeah, it is kind of rare that she does that.
Michelle,
I was wondering if since they used the word remark, and that was a remark, she actually directly thought those exact words, and since they used the remark, that the quotations would be used.
Yes. In Yeah, I think the secret part of it makes it clear that she's saying it to herself and not to Henry. So was someone else?
Michelle, I have a question. Yeah, so I'm wondering if in Austen's intended audience was to read these aloud in the evening initially as a young writer, especially. So how would the way that she planned to use her writing have influenced um, her choice of style?
Yeah,
So in my head, I mean, I'm clearly haven't given this a great deal of thought, but you'd think that having direct quotations would mean you'd want to do voices for the characters, maybe. And so maybe if it's indirect, you don't. It lets you just be more of a one person relaying the story as opposed to trying to do voices for the men versus the women or something. I don't know. What's your thought on that?
yeah, that's a really interesting thing to think about. Like how does that so there's like two things I think that are important for that. One is that a lot of people reread books. So like I think especially the later ones like Emma is really built to be reread. And like you enjoy it more the second time because you know how smart Austen is being and how many hints she's dropping. So they're sort of like getting the jokes better when you reread it. But that is interesting to think about, whether because she does move to, more of like, I'm going to be in someone's head, and then I'm going to like almost quote them directly, but not 100% directly. So it is kind of interesting to think about, yeah, how reading out loud, how that might have had an impact on the writing. Great question. I don't know if I have an answer. Any other questions about like direct quotation? So the second is where you're reporting, where Austen is kind of reporting someone's thoughts or feelings as the narrator fairly neutrally, and doing that using third person pronouns. So like she thought that Mr. Darcy was angry or something like that. There's no quotation marks. And like I said, they're pretty neutral. The words don't seem to belong to the specific character. And White and Smith call this focalization. So basically, the narrator's kind of focalizing on one character's point of view, feelings, motives, or thoughts. And so one of the articles that I read for this, William Nels talks about, not just thinking about the novel as having speaking parts, but also thinking about it as having thinking parts. And so that for him means characters whose consciousness the narrator reveals to us. And a lot of times we think like the only person that we get into the head of is just the heroine, but no, he says that there's 10 thinking parts for Emma, Persuasion, and Northanger Abbey, 12 for Sense and Sensibility, 13 for Mansfield Park, and 19 for Pride and Prejudice. Of course, we're more often going to be in the head of the heroine, but in Mansfield Park and Pride and Prejudice, there are a number of switches. And think about like Mansfield Park, there's a lot of times where Fanny's not there and, Austen is summarizing a conversation that was going on at the parsonage, or Edmund's going to the parsonage, or things like that. So that's just kind of interesting to think about, like how often the narrator is describing someone's thoughts or feelings. So this is an example, I'm pretty sure, of a pretty neutral reporting by a narrator. So this is when Darcy and Elizabeth are dancing, and they've kind of like just gotten kind of fed up with each other. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence. On each side, dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there was a tolerably powerful feeling towards her, which soon procured her pardon and directed all his anger against another. So I think this is not Darcy's specific words. I think this is more of just the narrator's words. Because I don't think that he would say, I'm procuring her pardon. He, might say like, well, it's all Wickham's fault. So the pronouns are used as third person pronouns, her, his, and then also when we think things, we usually would think things in the present tense, but this is reported in the past tense. So that's another sign usually that things are being summarized. Any questions about this one? All right, so the free and direct discourse. So basically what's happening in free and direct discourse is the narrator presents speech or thought in a way that has the idiomatic qualities of the speaker's words. And then another way of saying that is kind of the flavor of the exact words the character would have used in speech or thought. And we'll go through some examples, and it is a little bit challenging to get that clear when you're actually going through an example. So we'll talk about that. So just like the narrator reporting, you're using third person pronouns, you're usually using the past tense or the reporting tense. There's not quotation marks to set it off. Um, and White and Smith say that free and direct discourse is a kind of focalization. So you're still focalizing, but you're doing it with the flavor of the character. And then sometimes in the literature, free indirect discourse is called free indirect style or free indirect speech. And the original term was derived from French. Um, and but most of the ones that I've read use free indirect discourse. So this is an example from Mansfield Park at the ball. So it's kind of like Fanny is just this is before the dancing has started. She's kind of tired from talking to people, and so the narrator is telling us the first part. Could she have kept her eyes from wandering between Edmund and Mary Crawford? So that's sort of just narrator. And then we're getting into Fanny's head and using her words. She looked all loveliness, and what might not be the end of it. And so in the discussion questions, that website that I talked about, Austen said, um, they have this as an example of the free indirect discourse. There were lots of times that I thought there was free indirect discourse going on that they didn't highlight. So they might have been being super conservative about it. But does this sort of seem a clear example of like, oh, this is exactly what Fanny would say? Any questions? So there are some clues that you've got free and direct discourse. Italics are sometimes used to show that a character is literally thinking those exact words with just that emphasis. And if you've ever looked at Austen's manuscripts, she does use emphasis a lot of times where she puts things, she underlines them. Um, and then White and Smith talk about how the narrator might be using introductory phrases, such as she thought that, or he assured her that. And then another sign, Austen rarely uses exclamation points, but if an exclamation point is showing up, it is often like you're in the character's head thinking the character's thoughts. And kind of like, why do we care about free and direct discourse? What does it get you? So it can heighten the feelings or kind of dramatize the character's words. And it's kind of a way that free and direct that um, you can be inviting ridicule of a character. Um, and this is a pattern that they see in juvenilia. I don't agree that all of them are ridiculing. I feel like sometimes with Fanny, like if it's ridicule, it's pretty gentle. I think like with Emma, when we're in her head, it's definitely ridicule. But anyway, I have a couple of interesting examples. Um, but it can be tricky to spot free and direct discourse because it's usually got parts of it where that's the narrator's pretty neutral voice, and then it sort of morphs into the character's specific voice, and kind of figuring out like, hey, where did that happen? Can be interesting. William Nell says it can be free and direct discourse can be slippery, and not every instance is clear cut. So here's an example that I think is a good one from Catherine or the Bower. So again, the Catherine or the Bauer and the Watsons are not on the Austen said website. So these are examples that I thought was going on, and we can talk about that. She had already received a very severe lecture from her aunt, and this is where I think the free indirect discourse starts, on the imprudence of her behavior during the whole evening. She blamed her for coming to the ball, for coming in the same carriage with Edward Stanley, and still more for entering the room with him. So, this is either Catherine's summary of the aunt, what the aunt said, or it's just what the aunt said. But it's definitely like, this is the wording that Mrs. Percival would have used. And then the next thing, so then we're clearly in Catherine's head here. For the last mentioned offense, Catherine knew not what apology to give, and though she longed in answer to the second to say that she had not thought it would be civil to make Mr. Stanley walk, she dared not so to trifle with her aunt, who would have been but the more offended by it. The first accusation, however, she considered as very unreasonable, as she thought herself perfectly justified in coming. So the use of the italics with walk, and then the use of herself, using herself is often a sign that you're in the character's head. Do those make sense as examples where it's not just the narrator, but it's really sort of what Catherine would specifically say? So people who talk about free and direct discourse in connection with Austen are pretty clear that Austen uses it much more in a much more sophisticated way compared to earlier authors. So that you could see it in some of the earlier authors, like Fanny Burney or Maria Edgeworth, maybe. But they used it in a pretty simplistic way. And Austen really began to use it in a very sophisticated way. And I think especially in Emma, there's just a lot of it that goes on. And it's sort of deployed to manipulate our ironic understanding of her characters. And so this is from the article by White and Smith. And so William Galprin makes this sort of analogy that Austen's discovery of what free and direct discourse could do was comparable in the history of the novel to the discovery of the atomic bomb in the history of warfare. Thereafter, things were never the same, and free and direct discourse became a basic feature of the novel as a genre. Not sure that the atomic bomb metaphors. So we're going to talk about reading minds now. Any questions about the free and direct discourse before? So reading minds is a little bit different than free and direct discourse, because what we're talking about with reading minds is we're looking at the characters trying to make sense of the thoughts and feelings and motives of other people. So if you think about the plots of the novels, especially for Catherine, Emma, and Elizabeth, there's this real sense of like, they have to figure out like what's going on in the head of the men that are the ones they end up with, and the men that they realize are not the right people. And so to do that, they really have to kind of figure out like, hey, what is this person thinking? What is this person feeling? And you know, kind of this is what all of us have to do. So there's this concept in cognitive science that's called theory of mind. And it was initially developed or used a lot in relationship with understanding people with autism and sort of that they don't have good theory of mind. They have trouble understanding. So it's basically the ability to infer the beliefs, feelings, and intentions of others. So that's kind of the basics of what theory of mind is. And it's a skill that's essential for social interaction. Both getting along with and outmaneuvering others requires the ability to understand what they are thinking, feeling, and intending to do. So this is something that we as people interacting in the world need to be able to do. And it's what Austen is sort of telling us that is the important thing. So her heroines aren't going on a quest to become this, brave hero. They're going on a quest to figure out like how do you function in the world? How do you make sense of other people, and how do you figure out what people are thinking? Someone, I think it was Rosemary, had mentioned this scene where this is a later dance where Henry and Catherine are talking about Captain Tilney asking Isabella to dance. And so Henry tells her how very little trouble it can give you to understand the motive of other people's actions. Catherine says, "Why? What do you mean?" He says, "With you, it is not, how is such a one likely to be influenced? What is the inducement most likely to act upon such a person's feelings, age, situation, and probable habits of life considered? But how should I be influenced? What would be my inducement in acting so and so?" So he's basically telling her, you really should be thinking about where that person is coming from and not just thinking about yourself. But he kind of reverses it to tell her that, give her a compliment. So she says, "I do not understand you." And he says, "Then we are on very unequal terms, for I understand you perfectly." And they kind of have this little argument about whether he's going to tell her what he means or not. And then he says, "I only meant that you're attributing my brother's wish of dancing with Miss Thorpe to good nature alone convinced me of your being superior in good nature yourself to all the rest of the world." So he basically, kind of gives her a compliment, but he's told her that, it's more complicated to understand others' motives than what you think. So William Nels talks about Austen's interest in reading other people's minds being very congruent with 18th century philosophy, especially the work of David Hume. And so this is from Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. So the quote is, Hume is talking about how through our life experience, we learn the principles of human nature and we mount up to the knowledge of men's inclinations and motives from their actions, expressions, and even gestures, and again descend to the interpretation of their actions from our knowledge of their motives and inclinations. So basically, Hume is saying that you kind of look at other people's actions, expressions, and gestures, and based on your experience of human nature, you try to figure out what their motives and inclinations are. So Beth Law has written about kind of learning to read others' minds in Northanger Abbey. And, all of us want to shake her when people are lying to her and she's just taking it at face value. Um, so one of Catherine's tasks is to kind of learn to understand when people are being deceitful or insincere, or to try to take advantage of her. And part of the reason that she has trouble is because she grew up in a pretty sheltered place where she didn't have to deal with that. Um, so over the course of the novel, Catherine does improve in these skills. But what's interesting is Law says that, it's not just Catherine that has these problems. Um, the general is like totally oblivious to the fact that John Thorpe is lying to him. Her parents don't have a, good sense of like, why might Catherine be upset when she got back from a vacation? Her brother is just awful at reading Isabella and John. And even Isabella is pretty poor at reading Captain Tilney and figuring out that he's, just messing with her. So, it's not just Catherine that needs to learn how to read others' minds better. And so, the things that everybody uses to understand other people. So we kind of read people based on our relationship to them, how old they are, kind of what they're doing. So what Nels calls sociocultural evidence, but also body language and expressions, and especially the eyes. But he talks about some characters like Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, because they've got this big secret that they have to hide. They're really good at blocking telepathy or people being able to read their minds. And even Mr. Knightley in the beginning doesn't have a sense of what's going on with them. It's only once he's seen them kind of looking at each other in a way. Emma makes fun of him saying it's secret looks, but Knightley is kind of seen like, they're giving each other looks that aren't what you would expect from people that sort of have a pretty limited relationship. The other thing about learning to read other people's minds is it's harder to read minds of those outside of our social circle. So you see that like in Pride and Prejudice, where Elizabeth may be pretty good at reading like Sir William and things, but then Darcy comes, she doesn't really have any experience with him. And Wickham, she doesn't have a good a good way of reading him either. So, one of the things that the characters do and that sort of we do as readers. So we want to develop our ability of a perceptive and thoughtful person, given enough time, sufficient opportunity for observation to make accurate judgments about people's characters, thought processes, and feelings. Austen's protagonists are markedly less fallible by the end of the novel, as they narrow the gap between their growing reliability of judgment and the infallibility of the narrator. So in the article that I'm quoting is pretty interesting. He's basically saying that Austen's narrator isn't really omniscient because the narrator doesn't like see way into the future. The narrator doesn't follow people when they're far away. And the narrator can get into people's minds, but usually like when they're just in the sort of limited area. So I have a link in the references if anyone's interested in reading that. So I pulled a couple of examples from the different works about reading other people's minds. And these aren't examples from like Austen said. So this is in the Watsons when they just get at the dance. Among the increasing numbers of military men, one now made his way to Miss Edwards with an air of empressement, which I Google translated as eagerness, which decidedly said to her companion, "I am Captain Hunter." Emma, who could not but watch her at such a moment, saw her looking rather distressed, but by no means displeased, and heard an engagement formed for the first two dances, which made her think her brother Sam's a hopeless case. So Emma was told by her sister, Sam likes Mary Edwards, and find out what Mary Edwards does. Um, so Emma's trying to figure out like how much does Mary Edwards like Captain Hunter? And then she sort of like comes to the conclusion that Sam's case is hopeless. Um, so this, I think is the narrator report. But it's clearly a situation where Emma is like observing things and trying to figure out what's going on in Mary Edwards' mind. This is also Pride and Prejudice at the Netherfield Ball. This is when they're at dinner and Mrs. Bennet just will not stop talking in a way that incredibly embarrasses Elizabeth. But she's clearly like trying to keep track of what's going on with Darcy, what's he thinking, what's he feeling. Nothing she could say, however, had any influence. Her mother would talk of her views in the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth blushed and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded. For though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his intention was invariably fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. So on the Austen Said website, they don't have this as free and direct discourse. So this seems like an example of maybe it's just the narrator reporting, but it's clearly Elizabeth's thought process as she's trying to figure out like what is Darcy thinking, what's he feeling. So this is from Mansfield Park. Again, we're kind of in it's kind of like shifting between what happened with Edmund and Mary and then what Fanny thinks about it. So Edmund and Mary have been dancing. They had talked and they had been silent. He had reasoned, she had ridiculed, and they had parted at last with mutual vexation. Fanny, not able to refrain entirely from observing them, had seen enough to be tolerably satisfied. It was barbarous to be happy when Edmund was suffering, yet some happiness must and would arise from the very conviction that he did suffer. So we're in her head. She's happy that Edmund's suffering, but she's like clearly trying to figure out like what is going on between Mary and Edmund and what is Edmund feeling. And then on the Austen Said website, they do have the part that's highlighted as being, Fanny's direct words. Here's one from Emma that I think is free and direct discourse that Austen Said doesn't. So Frank Churchill seemed to have been on the watch, and though he did not say much, his eyes declared that he meant to have a delightful evening. So I think, again, this is like Emma's interpretation, not necessarily the narrator telling us this. Frank was standing by her, but not steadily. There was a restlessness which showed a mind not at ease. He was looking about, he was going to the door, he was watching for the sound of other carriages, impatient to begin or afraid of being always near her. I think that being afraid of being near her, I think is one of the free and direct discourses. And I think that's kind of one of those like little making fun of Emma that Austen often does with the free and direct discourse. But the Austen Said website didn't have that one. So those are just some examples of reading other people's minds, but it is through all of the works, all of the chapters that we read, like there are several examples, but especially in Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma, it happens a lot. Okay, so just we're almost done. Couple of questions. So thinking about the ball scenes, do you see changes over time, like comparing the early chapters to the later chapters? Changes over time in how much Austen represents characters' thoughts and feelings, either directly from the narrator or through the character's specific words as free and direct discourse. And then similarly, are there changes over time in her portrayal of characters' inferences about the thoughts, feelings, and motives of other characters? There's a lot of comedy, I think, when characters make wrong inferences about others' thoughts and feelings. Some argue that through sharing the joke about the character's inferential mistakes, we become friends of the narrator. So, like, we're sort of joined with the narrator in having a little chuckle about Emma thinking that Frank Churchill is afraid of being near her, and just kind of curious if people feel that connection. And then I'm going to give Collins Hemingway the last word. Austen is the one we read because she is the first one to do the novel right. Okay. So hopefully that was clear. I don't know if people have read about free and direct discourse before and know about it. When I started reading about it just like made the complexity of what I was reading so much, like it just seemed like, oh, there's so much more going on in the novel than I think there is. So yeah, what are your thoughts about, so we've got two things. We've got sort of like, how does Austen show what's going on inside the characters? And then how do the characters try to figure out what everybody else is thinking and feeling?
So my question is, why do you think she chose ballroom scenes for all of these pivotal um points? Because I'm thinking about Persuasion. A lot of the pivotal points were during walks, um, or where there's two or more people that are walking together and talking together. But what makes a ballroom scene conducive to all of these pivotal points in her novels?
Yeah, any thoughts? That's a great question, Renata.
Well, there's certainly ample opportunity to interact with the whole, maybe perhaps a larger group of people all at one time, because so much is revealed about characters in the way they behave and also in how they speak, whether it be Mrs. Elton or, I don't know, Tilney or other characters. Um, it, you really get to know their characters and whether they're on the good or the not so good list. So maybe it could be partly that.
Yeah. What's interesting is you have the ability in a ball scene to have dyadic dialogue, so just two people talking, and then you have the ability to have the group dialogue. So that, that's, I think when you look at sort of the proprieties of the day. Dancing was one of the few times that men and women who weren't engaged actually could talk to each other and have physical contact also. So, and then, there's the larger groups when they're like eating dinner or eating supper or sitting down and waiting. So that's a really good question.
It's also a time when you can see, like if you when Elizabeth was still interested in Wickham, and she's off to the side, and one of her sisters said, "Oh, who's Wickham dancing with now? That redheaded girl." It was Mary King, and so they're gossiping and filling you in on some of the other competition that Lizzie might have, and so those kinds of conversations are. And observing the behavior of someone you might think you're interested in, watching him in a larger social environment is important to know how he is with you one-on-one versus what other games he might be up to.
Mm.
Yeah, great point.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah, and do you interpret that behavior correctly, which Elizabeth clearly does not. Does anyone else have the sort of like feeling of connection with the narrator when like, oh, when we're saying to ourselves, rolling our eyes at Emma and saying, "Oh, Emma," or "Oh, Catherine." Nobody else?
I get that feeling a lot, especially when Mr. Collins starts dancing. I think the narrator does a great job of engaging us to laugh at him indirectly. His missteps and his misinterpreter reading the minds of his fair cousins, that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
There's definitely like some times in that Netherfield ball scene where Elizabeth seems to be like a little bit overreacting to things. Like it says, at the end of the dance with Collins that like the moment of her release was ecstasy. And they didn't have that as a free and direct discourse, but I thought that's gotta be Emma, that's gotta be Elizabeth's word because, like she's a little extreme in the in the Netherfield ball in terms of how she thinks about things.
Uh-huh.
Like how she's so angry at Darcy because of Wickham and kind of over the top in how she thinks about it. Um, we didn't one of the things that I think a lot of the um, adaptations lose is they lose the inner workings that Austen gets so well. But I really like how in the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, like Keira Knightley is just so angry. And it's like she's so fierce. And I kind of feel like that's kind of how Jane Austen wrote that scene. Like she's um pretty extreme in like how angry she is at Darcy. Any other thoughts or questions? Really appreciate everyone's participation and thought you had a lot of great questions. All right, I am going to stop the recording. Oops.